Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach F1 channel. I hope you are all doing amazing and welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. So this will be all about what you'll need to do with your teams for Canada. But before we get into that, let's talk about how well my team did in Monaco. 218 points. Oscar Piastri and Charles Leclerc, the standout drivers in my team, with Leclerc getting 90 points as he was my ×2. Very happy with that. Bottas was good, a 1 million increase. Sargent, it did what I expected you to do as well. However, getting that -32 from Hulkenberg did really ruin my chances of having an amazing weekend. However, McLaren Ferrari did better than Red Bull, very happy with that. And overall, with the global leagues, I'm still 162nd in the world, so I'll happily take a break-even week for me, considering how bad it was for some drivers. But anyway, like and subscribe, follow me on Twitter, join the Discord, and join the F1 League. But let's get straight into it. So there are quite a few things we need to talk about going into this weekend, F1 fantasy wise, and it's because the way the teams are all working is changing quite a lot every weekend now. So first off, let's talk about, is a Verstappen build really necessary anymore? And for me, it's very much a big no. And this is because when Verstappen was guaranteed wins, even without fastest lap or driver of the day, he would get first or second amount of points. However, with Leclerc, with Norris, with Piastri, with Sainz, with all of the McLarens and the Ferraris looking good, if he does not win the race, he will not get nowhere near enough points to compete with whoever gets driver of the day. And most likely that will be Leclerc or Norris or whoever comes second, which really screws over anyone who's still got the Verstappen build. As in most cases, if you still have the Verstappen build, you will only have Verstappen as your one premium driver. Then there is an issue, as a lot of people are able to bring in two premium drivers, where if your one premium driver is scoring similar points to Verstappen, and you've got a second one then scoring more than whoever you would have had there instead, which would have been a Tsunoda or Stroll, which then could lead to you losing around 10 to 20 points on the other teams each race. Now, is it a bad build? By all means, no. However, it's by far not the meta anymore, and your money could be better off being used for two premium drivers instead of that one of Verstappen. Then constructor-wise, we've actually got two constructors we need to think about most. Now, for me, let's talk about Mercedes first, and that is because they could be bringing in upgrades at Canada. It might be Canada or Spain. We'll see once we get there. However, Mercedes are still in the lower end of the pricing, and with McLaren now over that 25 million price of not getting those 1 million increases anymore, we've really got to consider if Mercedes is an option. Now, it might sound crazy, however, Mercedes are sort of in this weird limbo area around 7th to 8th, 6th, 7th, 8th, where they have such a gap to the likes of Tsunoda, Hulkenberg, Alonso, Stroll, whoever's in that like 9th, 10th, 8th position, that they tend to always have a free pit stop. And what comes with free pit stops? A fastest lap at the end of the race, which has happened at Imola and at Monaco, which means they get an extra 10 points as a constructor, which basically means if as a constructor they only get around 35 to 40 points, that extra 10 points really boosts them very close to the likes of Red Bull, Ferrari and McLaren, to the point where you could be saving your money putting it into better drivers and still coming out with a constructor who will get you very good points. Now, for me, I still think it's a little bit too early to be doing this. McLaren, Ferrari and even Red Bull still look like the better options, especially when we're relying on them having this 20-30 second gap each race to get fastest lap, because if they don't have that, then they will get you a lot less points. However, it is something worth mentioning, and it definitely is something worth using if you don't have enough money for the McLaren and Ferrari builds. Now, we also need to talk about another constructor, which is Red Bull. And this is because of both their drivers' performances. Now, Verstappen, yes, Monaco, he came P6, wasn't the best. However, when he wins the race, he will get you around 35 points. He won't ever get driver of the day because Verstappen never gets driver of the day. And he won't get fastest lap because of Mercedes using that gap they will have to an extra car to go for fastest lap. However, Red Bull-wise, they've also got the issue of Perez. He's starting to dip back into that form he had going into this part of the season last year, which is affecting him again. He crashed out in Monaco and was knocked out in Q2 in Imola, only managing to rescue a P8 from that race. Now, especially with McLaren and Ferrari looking so close to Red Bull, it's just not good enough, especially when they are the most expensive constructor by about 3.3 million. They have to be doing the best and by quite some more. Especially with that 3 million, you could improve your team quite significantly elsewhere. Now, the only saving grace for Red Bull is they have another thing like Mercedes, where they have fastest pit stops. Red Bull are notorious for having the best pit stops on the grid, and this can be seen at most races, with Red Bull getting 10 points for fastest pit stop in Monaco, another 10 points in Imola, 5 extra points in Miami, 18 points in Japan, and it just continues throughout the season. So even when Red Bull have a stinker, potentially only get 40-ish points in a race weekend, those fastest pit stop points, like Mercedes, will boost them again to sort of be when no one crashes out. They are a safe option. They will still get around the McLaren Ferrari points. Now, I don't think they are the top constructor anymore because, again, you're relying on something which could maybe not happen. However, it's still very much a thing to think of. Yes, Red Bull probably aren't the constructor you would want these days in your team. They still are third, fourth best option because of fastest pit stops. But now let's move on to some of the drivers, where we'll start off with the best driver under 7.5 million. Now, at the moment, we have Bottas at 7.5 million, Zhou at 7.4 million, and Sargent at 5.8 million. Now, I'll go from worst to best for my rankings, and worst place has to now be Valtteri Bottas. F1 fantasy-wise, he is not who you want. In Monaco, he was a decent shout because he can do okay in qualifying. Didn't work out like that. He still had a pretty decent race because of a lot of things going on around him. And because of Monaco, he has gone up 1 million in price. There is no way in hell that Bottas should be more valuable than Zhou. F1 fantasy-wise, Zhou is much better. Better on overtaking, better on race positions gained. Bottas normally qualifies a bit too high and then drops down. Zhou does the opposite. He qualifies a bit lower and goes up. So there is no way in hell that Bottas should be 7.5 million, and his price will start to drop again. So if you have Bottas, I'd recommend moving over to someone else. Now, second place would be Sargent, purely because he's cheap, 5.8 million. If you need money elsewhere in your team for a better premium driver, then it is 100% worth having Sargent. Now, he is a dud driver, I like to say. He will get you around -5 points to 5 points. Most race weekends, he's not going to get more than 1 or 2 points because he doesn't really do much. However, that's what you want from a 5.8 million driver. Just got to hope he doesn't crash out, and then it's just about saving money by having him. But by far, the best driver under 7.5 million is Zhou Guanyu at 7.4 million. He is just an amazing asset to have in F1 Fantasy, and his price is staggering. Sauber are getting their pit stops better, which is perfect. And like what I said about him when talking about Bottas, it really is bad qualifying, but good at overtaking, good at getting those extra points elsewhere. So he is just a no-brainer for under 7.5 million. So drivers under 10 million, the worst driver I think to have, especially for Canada, would be Daniel Ricciardo. At his price of 8.9 million, there are so many better drivers, only a little bit more money than him, or some better drivers that are actually cheaper than him. He hasn't really been performing that well in that V-carb. He's had quite a lot of mistakes throughout the season, and I just think considering his form, and considering since Japan in F1 Fantasy, he has only had 1 point scoring weekend, I just don't think he is good enough to be on anyone's team and would not recommend him at all. Now, next up on the list would be Pierre Gasly as second worst, 8.1 million. He's pretty cheap, which is good, and he is pretty reliable. Now, I wouldn't say he was a bad option in your team. If someone had him, I wouldn't say it was the worst option at all. There are still better drivers I would consider. However, he normally gets around that 5 to 10 point, which we want from cheap drivers. And it sounds pretty weird because I'm actually saying a lot of pros for him. However, it does just show that there are a lot better drivers out there, as I can't really think of a lot of bad reasons to pick Gasly. However, there are still better drivers on the list. And the next one that's coming up is Alex Albon. Now, the reason I didn't put him lower in the Williams is because they are bringing upgrades that are apparently supposed to turn around their season. So, if at 8.3 million can either get into the final part of qualifying, we've seen last season where he had a train behind him at Canada, so it is possible for him to score points. I think it could be a very good weekend for Albon. He's normally very good around Canada, so for me he would be a very good option to have. Just be wary of Williams' reliabilities. That's the only reason he's not higher up in this list, and that's because the Williams tends to not be able to finish a race. Now, next up, funnily enough on this list, if he is driving at the Canadian Grand Prix, if not, the person who replaces him will still be a good shout because they'll be very cheap. However, it is Esteban Ocon. Now, the reason for this, especially at 8.9 million, he's got a 5-place grid penalty. You're probably thinking, why the hell would I pick him? Well, there's a few very good reasons, and it does all revolve around the 5-place grid penalty. First off, he will most likely be starting around 20th. I can't see him qualifying any higher than 12th, so he'll probably start 17th or lower, which is perfect F1 fantasy wise. We want a driver who qualifies badly and can push up during the grid, and if he can show that Alpine has a bit of pace in qualifying and then has to redo it on the track, a lot of overtake points and a lot of position gained points. However, the only issue with Ocon is it being Ocon. He might have a crash, he's not got a seat next season, so also he might be a little bit chaotic. However, high risk, high reward, I think Ocon is a really good option right now for Canada. Then we have Nico Hülkenberg. Again, he is very much a good driver to have. You have to take their results at Monaco with a pinch of salt, and yes, it will be hard to be using Haas drivers again after what they did, after just how bad Monaco was. However, nothing has changed F1 fantasy wise, where Hülkenberg and Magnussen are great options. Hülkenberg, again, could qualify in Q3. He needs to just stay around there, and he'll get around 5 to 10 points, which is what we want. Now, the second best option is his teammate K-Mag. Now, he is very close to missing a race. However, until he does miss a race, he is a good option as well. At 8.9 million, he gets so many overtaking points and race position games points. Again, like with Zhou, he tends to not do very good in qualifying and makes it up all in the race because he's very racy. He likes to, you know, get involved, which is very high risk, high reward, which is what you need from your cheap drivers realistically in F1 Fantasy. And that's why he's second on the list. A very bad race in Monaco. However, overall F1 Fantasy wise, he is such a good option to have, especially at Canada where you can overtake a bit more. So looking forward, I still think Magnussen is a very good option. However, first place still goes to Yuki Tsunoda. Like Hülkenberg, you have the issue where he qualifies quite highly. With where VCARB is going, and with Tsunoda's form at the minute, he has been scoring points left, right, and centre. And if he keeps up that form, he will get a 5 to 10 points, which is what you need again to hopefully get that 0.5 million increase, and also just be a very consistent cheap driver. Now let's talk about the premium drivers. Now, you have the clear fight that is starting to take place, which is Norris versus Leclerc, and it seems like it's very track related to whoever will get the most points. Now, the best thing about these two, and it can still have Sainz and Piastri, but I'll talk about them later, is even if they come second place to Verstappen, they will get more points than him. Whoever comes second gets driver of the day, and they get the 18 points plus the 10 points plus their qualifying points, which tends to mean that they get more points than Verstappen, which is just so good. The only issue with Norris is he's now above that 25 million threshold, which Leclerc isn't, which pushes me a bit more to Leclerc. However, if McLaren look better this race, pick Norris. If Ferrari look better this race, pick Leclerc. Same goes with Piastri and Sainz as their teammates. Piastri's been very good in qualifying recently, and if he keeps up this form, he could be winning a race very soon. Again, Sainz, he had very good form at the start. He's dipped a little bit now, and he got quite lucky in Monaco to be able to carry on because the red flag came out just before they finished the lap. With the Ferrari and McLaren drivers, they by far are the best 4 options when picking your team. For me, the best 2 options are still Leclerc and Piastri, purely because you can still build a bit more budget around them as well, and because Piastri has been looking a little bit better than Norris recently. However, all 4 are very good options, and realistically, for me, are the only premium drivers I would go for. Perez is a no-go at the minute, as yes, Canada, you can overtake, so if he's a bad qualifying, he could still do well. However, he won't get driver of the day, and I doubt he'd get fastest lap, so it's a bit of an issue, considering you have to take quite a high risk, bring him in, hoping he won't crash, and hoping that his qualifying's bad enough to then get a few overtakes. Very risky play. Verstappen, too expensive right now, especially when he's not getting those permanent first places, and then both Mercedes drivers are just too expensive now, with them being 20.4 million and 20.5 million respectively. Piastri is only 0.9 and 0.8 million more expensive, and I really do think unless you are really strapped for cash and you can't make that jump up to Piastri, there's no reason to go for one of Mercedes when Piastri is that close in value. So premium drivers wise, you want to stick with the McLaren and Ferrari boys. Let's now have a look at the team selections. So with the limitless on screen, don't worry too much. I'm just doing this so I can show you each and every team variation you can do. But team selection wise, it has to be McLaren Ferrari builds as the top teams to choose from. Now, they are very expensive these days, with the minimum team being 112.6 million. If you have the money, it's by far the best teams to go. Now, for picking your teams in Canada, the first things you are going to want to look at is your 2 premium drivers. Now, like I said, if Ferrari look like the best option, then your team will have a baseline of something like this. If McLaren look like the best option, then you would have a baseline like this. Now, this is why I mentioned last race weekend why it's so important to have free transfers available, as you have so much leeway when it comes to your team. However, if you have extra money lying about, you can also change your cheap drivers, which I would recommend first of all getting rid of Bottas and bringing in Hülkenberg. If you have even more money than this, Hülkenberg to Magnussen, and then if you have even more money than that, Magnussen to Yuki Tsunoda. And you can do the same with the Ferrari boys as well. Now, like I said, you can also have Ferrari and McLaren drivers in as well, which I think is very good if you don't want all your eggs in one basket. Leclerc and Piastri still very good. It's the better budget team as well. And again, if you don't have enough money, you can drop Tsunoda back down to a Magnussen, to a Hülkenberg, to a Bottas. However, those are the best teams you could probably use in F1 Fantasy right now. And also, if you have the money to increase from Sargent to Hülkenberg, I would. However, I would very much focus on the 2 premium drivers this weekend as your main priority. And then if you have other free transfers, look at your cheap drivers as well. However, there is a new team that is emerging, which I quite like the look of. However, it still very much is a team where if you don't have that budget of 112.6 million, then I would use this team. And this team revolves around having Mercedes instead of McLaren. This one very much is for if you don't have enough money for the McLaren Ferrari teams and you're trying to get that budget up to be able to use them. Mercedes will go up in price, Ferrari will go up in price, and all the drivers you can put in there will go up in price as well. Now, this would probably be the best option for the Mercedes Ferrari teams with Leclerc and Piastri and Tsunoda. However, if you don't have the money, what you would need to do is drop Tsunoda back down to a Bottas, and then you could also fiddle about with Leclerc being dropped down to a Sainz. However, on the flip side, if you have over 117.2 million in the bank, then I would actually suggest having a look at a team like this, Mercedes Ferrari as constructors, and guess which premium driver you can use with another premium driver. That is right, Max Verstappen. Now, I would very much again focus, if you have more than 117.2 million, on bringing in an even better second premium driver for the likes of Charles Leclerc if Ferrari look good, and again Norris if McLaren look good. I know a few people will have team values at around 120 million, and if you have even that amount of money, you could go for the likes of dropping Bottas, then going up to Hülkenberg, again Hülkenberg up to Magnussen, or Magnussen up to Tsunoda. That is an amazing team. Yes, you're risking not getting driver of the day, Piastri maybe not being the best premium driver if you go for improving the cheap drivers as well. However, if you could get 2 premium drivers in, and one of them is Verstappen, even with dropping down from McLaren to Mercedes, it genuinely might be worth it. Now, a lot of people won't have the team value for this. I don't really have the team value for this. However, a few will, so it's just something to think about. Will you want to do it? It will definitely be a differential team, so it might be worth doing if you're very high ranked and you want another team to sort of push you even further up. This team is very much an unknown team. You have to really hope Mercedes do well, and you have to hope that Verstappen outpaces both McLarens and Ferraris in each race for this team to do better. And then there are a few team selections I would steer clear of, and that is the alternate version of the Mercedes teams you could use, as if you go for one of the Mercedes drivers, you might get stuck at your sort of price range, as McLaren will not be going up much more in value each race as they're above that 25 million threshold, so you have to be careful with this team if you use it. I wouldn't recommend going for one of the Mercedes drivers. Then for anyone who has under 110 million in team value, I would recommend a team that looks very similar to this. Leclerc, he's a good driver, could be getting driver of the day, could be getting 1 million increases. Yuki Tsunoda, like I've said, a very good option under 10 million. Both Hasses, good at overtaking, and Hülkenberg can occasionally fight for those top 10 positions, especially in qualifying. And then Stroll, yes, he's had a few iffy races recently. However, again, like we want to use, if he has a bad qualifying, he tends to get a few overtakes and positions gained in the race. And it's mainly just about having that Mercedes Ferrari for increasing your budget, as if you are at 110 million, if you stick with the base builds of McLaren Ferrari, Red Bull Ferrari, with Perez, Leclerc, Norris, you are at a point where you probably would not be able to catch up to the teams that have more team value. So you have to put points on the back burner for now and try to increase the budget, especially if you're at this sort of team value range. Now, if you need to drop any drivers, I would recommend, if you still need to save a bit of money on this team, dropping Stroll down to Ocon, and then Ocon down to Zhou. Then if you have a little bit more money, or you think Lando Norris will get driver of the day, as it won't help your budget too much, but it'll be really useful to have the 2x driver who has driver of the day, then I'd recommend swapping to a Norris build. Same case applies for Piastri, and again for Carlos Sainz. So those are the teams I'd recommend for anyone under 110 million. Now, chips wise for Canada, again, like I can't keep mentioning enough, if it's not a sprint race, don't use a chip. Now that rule's pretty good for most races, and it's the same for Canada, especially for these chips. Autopilot, you will want to wait until a sprint race weekend, as if you don't get your 2x driver right on a sprint race weekend, it can be very detrimental to your full team, and you can save a lot more points doing it on a sprint race weekend. Limitless, the same. No negative, the same. Extra DRS, the same. Now, final fix, again, if one of your premium drivers doesn't look very good, then you could swap over. Say you had a Norris and Leclerc puts it on pole or on second, and you know he's probably going to get driver of the day, then you could final fix over to Leclerc on those situations. You'll want to make sure when you final fix, it's for quite a few points and not for anything less than 5 points. Then again, wildcard, it depends on where your team is at the minute. For most cases, if you have free transfers available, then you probably will not have to use wildcard. And then again, for my league, we now have 688 people in it. Thank you so much all for joining. Here is the code. I'll put the link back in the description as per usual. And of course, I'll give a top 5 shout out once more. So of course, we still have #1 Paddock, here I come, doing very well in first place. Congratulations. He's been first place for quite a while. Then we have Colt Viet flat out. I'm very sorry for the pronunciation if I've screwed that up. Very well done with 2,159 points. Then we have Omer FC Inter, 2,141 points in third place. Pesa Racing 3, 2,134 points. And then Obi Guan Yujobi in 5th place. Congratulations to all of you. And my God, might I just add, it's very exciting from 6th place down to 16th. And I'd say even lower than that, because everyone is just so close on points. But thank you all so much for joining. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video today. I hope you all came out knowing a bit more about F1 Fantasy, which teams to choose for Canada, which drivers, constructors look the best, and which drivers and constructors not to choose. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all later for another F1 video later on this week. Bye bye.